The air in the Charlotte luxury hotel ballroom was thick, almost suffocating, smelling of expensive French cologne, aged scotch, and a subtle, metallic scent of desperation that only I seemed to notice. I stood there, hidden behind the heavy glass doors for a moment, just watching the vultures circle their prey. My family, the Harpers, were seated in the absolute front row, front and center, exactly where they always thought they belonged, like royalty unaware that their kingdom had already been sold to the highest bidder. I watched my father. He sat ramrod straight, his shoulders squared as if he were carrying the weight of a legacy that had actually turned to ash months ago. His fingers were wrapped so tightly around his white bidding paddle that his knuckles were turning a ghostly white. And Ryder, my younger brother, he was leaning back with that same insufferable smug grin, the one he wore when he was 15 and watched me pack my only suitcase in the rain. He was laughing, whispering into the ear of our cousin Hayden, probably joking about how they were going to spend the profits from a retail chain they hadn't even bought yet. My mother was there too, smoothing an invisible crease on her silk dress, a nervous habit she's had since I was a child. Whenever the bank accounts got low, she would fix her clothes instead of her life. They looked so confident, so untouchable, but I knew the truth. I knew every single dollar they had left was sitting on that table, squeezed out of a second mortgage on a house they couldn't afford. They were betting everything on Evelyn Rose, a luxury retail empire, thinking it would be their salvation. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, and pushed through the doors. The sound of my heels on the marble floor was like a clock ticking down to their extinction. Click, click, click. I walked straight to the registration desk, oblivious to the whispers starting to ripple through the crowd. Who is she? Is she with the Miami group? I didn't look at them. I only looked ahead. I slid a bank letter across the counter. It was issued under Harper Capital Holdings, the legal entity I'd spent a decade building in the dark. The woman behind the desk looked at the letter, then at her screen, then back at me, her eyes widening until they were dinner plates. "Welcome back, Miss Harper," she whispered, handing me the sleek black paddle number 47. "You are approved for unlimited bidding." I can still taste the rain from that night, metallic, cold, and smelling of wet asphalt. I was 18 years old, a girl who had just walked across a stage to receive a high school diploma, thinking my life was finally beginning. But as I stood on that driveway, looking back at the house that was supposed to be my sanctuary, I realized it was nothing more than a beautiful prison. My father had called me into the living room just an hour before. His voice hadn't trembled. He hadn't even looked me in the eye. "We're done carrying dead weight, Autumn," he'd said, as calmly as if he were discussing the weather. "Pack whatever you can carry tonight and get out." My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the zipper of my old brown suitcase, the one my grandmother had given me years ago. It was scuffed, the handle was weak, but it was all I had. I threw in 3 pairs of jeans, a few sweaters, and the small shoe box hidden under my bed. Inside that box was my secret, $237, every penny I'd saved from secret babysitting jobs and cleaning neighbors' garages. It wasn't much, but in that moment it felt like $1 million. It was my only ticket to survival. Ryder stood in the doorway of my bedroom, watching me struggle. He was only 15, but he already had that cruel streak that my father admired. He didn't offer to help. He didn't say he'd miss me. He just leaned there, smirking. "About time we got rid of the parasite," he said loud enough for the neighbors to hear, if they were listening. I didn't respond. I didn't cry. I just pulled the zipper shut, hearing the sound echo in the empty room, a sound that signaled the end of my childhood and the beginning of a war they didn't even know I was fighting. I walked down the stairs, past my mother, who was busy staring at a magazine, refusing to look up as her only daughter walked out of her life. I didn't wait for a goodbye. I knew it wasn't coming. I stepped out into the night, the rain soaking through my thin jacket instantly. I walked 3 miles to the Greyhound station, the wheels of that old suitcase clicking against the uneven pavement. Click, clack, click, clack. It was the only sound in the world, a rhythm that I would hear in my dreams for the next 13 years. Telling me to keep moving, telling me to never look back, telling me that one day I would be the one standing in the light, and they would be the ones left in the rain. The first 3 years after that bus ride, they didn't feel like a life. They felt like a sentence. I landed in Atlanta with nothing but that brown suitcase and a hunger that wouldn't go away. I found a job at a diner off Peachtree Street, a place where the sun never seemed to shine, and the air always smelled of old fryer oil, burnt coffee, and the quiet desperation of people who had nowhere else to go. I worked the graveyard shift, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., because the tips were slightly better, and the darkness outside matched the way I felt inside. My feet were always swollen, my back felt like it was breaking by the 4th hour, but every time I felt like collapsing, I would reach into my pocket and touch the few crumpled dollar bills I'd earned. Independence. I whispered to myself, over and over like a prayer. I lived in a studio apartment the size of a closet. The walls were so thin I could hear my neighbors breathing. I slept on a futon that I found on a sidewalk, but I didn't care. I wasn't there to be comfortable. I was there to build a fortress. While my family was probably sitting down to 5-course dinners, I was eating lukewarm ramen noodles straight out of the cup to save time. Every morning at 7 a.m., after my shift ended, I would head straight to the community college, my eyes red from lack of sleep, my skin smelling of grease. I sat in the front row of my finance classes, absorbing every word, every formula, every strategy. The other students looked at me like I was a ghost, a girl with no name and no future. They didn't see the fire burning behind my tired eyes. They didn't know I was calculating the exact moment. I would take back everything the world owed me. Every dollar I saved, every penny I pinched, went into an account I'd opened under a name they would never recognize. I stopped being Autumn Harper, the rejected daughter. I became a machine. I didn't go out. I didn't make friends. I didn't buy new clothes. I wore the same 3 uniforms until the fabric was see-through. I was invisible, and in that invisibility, I found my greatest strength, because when you are nothing, you can become anything, and I was becoming their worst nightmare. By the time I turned 24, the world looked different, and so did I. I had managed to save $93,000, a fortune built on thousands of midnight shifts and missed meals. I didn't want a car. I didn't want a house. I wanted a weapon. I found it in a small, failing clothing chain that was being liquidated by the banks. 6 stores, dusty, forgotten, and located in the heart of North Carolina, just a few hours away from the parents who thought I was dead, or worse, a failure. I walked into the lawyer's office, wearing a suit I'd bought from a thrift store, and tailored myself. I didn't look like a waitress. I looked like a threat. I signed the papers, using a newly formed company, Harper Capital Holdings. I chose the name because it was a slap in the face they wouldn't feel for years. To the bank, I was just another investor. To my family, I was still the ghost they'd chased away. That was the first time I felt it, the rush of power, the realization that money isn't just paper, it's a shield and a sword. I didn't sleep for the next 18 months. I lived in those stores. I slept on the floor of the back offices. I fired the lazy managers. I redesigned the floor plans, and I negotiated directly with suppliers who tried to bully me. They thought because I was young, because I was a woman, I would break. They didn't know I'd been broken a long time ago, and I'd put myself back together with iron and spite. 18 months later, I sold the chain for just over $1 million. My first 7-figure win. When the money hit my account, I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just sat in the dark, watching the numbers on the screen. I thought about Ryder, probably spending my father's money on fast cars and shallow friends. I thought about my father, bragging at the golf club about his legacy. They were so comfortable, so safe. They had no idea that the girl they threw away was now sitting on a mountain of cash, waiting for the perfect moment to bury them under it. The war had officially begun, and I was the only one who knew the score. By 27, I had become a master of shadows. I had moved my base of operations to a quiet, high-security office in Midtown Atlanta. My name never appeared on public records, but my influence was everywhere. I watched from the sidelines as Harper and Sons, my father's pride and joy, began to bleed out. The world was changing, fashion was moving online, and my father was too arrogant to adapt. He was still trying to sell 1990s suits to a 2020s world. I saw the bank starting to circle like sharks, waiting for a drop of blood. I didn't wait for the sharks to bite. I became the ocean. I contacted the senior debt holders of his flagship store, the massive 3-story building in Charlotte that he treated like a temple, through a blind trust. I offered to buy the entire debt at 80 cents on the dollar. The bank was relieved to be rid of him. Within 48 hours, I was no longer his daughter. I was his landlord. He was paying rent to a ghost, and that ghost had my face. It was the first time in years I actually felt like I could breathe. I started sending the default notices myself, through an anonymous legal firm. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in. I wanted him to wake up at 3 a.m. with his heart racing, wondering which favor he could call in to save his skin. I heard through industry whispers that my mother had to sell her summer home in the Hamptons. I heard that Ryder was begging for a seat on the board, only to be told there was no board left. They were losing their grip on the world, and they didn't even know who was pulling the rug from under them. Every check he signed, every desperate letter he wrote to his new landlord begging for a grace period, ended up on my desk. I read them all, sometimes twice. I remembered the cold rain on that Greyhound bus. I remembered the smell of the diner grease, and I would simply mark his requests with a red stamp. Denied. I wasn't being cruel. I was being fair. He had taught me that the world doesn't care about dead weight. And now, I was just showing him how well I'd learned the lesson. The silence that followed my bid was absolute. It wasn't just a quiet room. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a building collapses. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of a siren outside, and the heavy, ragged breathing of my father 3 rows in front of me. $35 million. The auctioneer repeated, his voice cracking for the first time in 30 years. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I could see the realization in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a girl. He was looking at the new owner of Evelyn Rose. Ryder was the first one to turn around. His movements were slow, like he was underwater. When his eyes finally locked onto mine, the smugness didn't just fade. It evaporated. He looked like he had seen a ghost, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the black paddle in my hand, then at my face, then back at the paddle. No. I saw his lips move, but no sound came out. The freeloader he wanted security to throw out had just spent more money than he would ever see in 10 lifetimes. My father didn't turn around, not at first. He just stared at the stage, his shoulders sagging as if the air had been let out of him. The $25.5 million he had bid, his absolute ceiling, was a joke compared to my $35 million. He had gambled the house, the legacy, the last of their dignity, and he had lost it all to a name he didn't even recognize. Harper Capital Holdings. When he finally did turn, his eyes weren't full of anger. They were full of terror. The kind of terror you feel when you realize the person you destroyed is the only one who can save you. Sold. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood was like a gunshot. Crack. It echoed off the marble walls, off the crystal chandeliers, and deep into the bones of every Harper in that room. I didn't move. I didn't cheer. I just lowered my paddle and let out a slow, steady breath. 13 years, 4,745 days, all leading to this 1 second. The girl they threw away was gone, and in her place stood a woman who had just bought the only thing they ever loved, their status. Their world was over, and mine was just beginning. The private corridor behind the ballroom felt like a wind tunnel. The air was cold, and the walls seemed to lean in as the door slammed open. Ryder was the first one through. His face was no longer gray. It was a violent shade of crimson. He stormed toward me, his $4,000 shoes squeaking on the marble floor. "Where the hell did you get that kind of money?" he barked. His voice was cracking, jumping an octave as he stepped right into my personal space. I could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath, the scent of a man who had been drinking to celebrate a victory that never came. Tell me right now, he screamed, his finger jabbing the air just inches from my eyes. You don't just drop 35 million like it's pocket change. Who are you working for? Which rich boyfriend is bankrolling the stunt? I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just looked at his trembling finger, then up at his bloodshot eyes. My silence was like gasoline on his fire. Behind him, my father pushed forward, his eyes narrowed into slits. Don't you dare play games with us. Autumn, he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Nobody pulls a stunt like that without something dirty behind it. Is this fraud? A loan shark deal? Then came my mother. She pushed past both of them, her eyes filling with those practiced tears I'd seen 1,000 times. You can't do this to your own family. Autumn, she whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and fear. That chain, Evelyn Rose, it was supposed to save us. How could you be so cruel? How could you steal our future? I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel any guilt. I didn't feel that old, familiar ache in my chest. I only felt pity. They still thought they were the victims. I waited for the silence to stretch, until it became heavy, until they were forced to stop shouting just to breathe. My company operates under a different legal entity, I said, my voice perfectly level, like a calm sea before a storm. You never once asked what I've been doing for the last 13 years. You never cared enough to even Google my name, so you never found out that I don't need a boyfriend or a loan shark to buy what I want. I saw my father's jaw drop. I didn't steal your future, I added, stepping closer to him. I simply bought it because I could afford it and you couldn't. 3 weeks later, the dust was finally settling, but the work was just beginning. I stood in the center of the flagship store on Tryon Street, watching the installers hang the new logo. Evelyn Rose, it looked different now, sharper, more modern. The old, cluttered displays were gone, replaced by minimalist glass and warm, inviting light. I had spent 20 hours a day here, making sure every inch of this place felt like me and not them. The front glass door chimed a soft silver sound, and I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. I could feel the energy in the room shift, the air becoming heavy with Padua, with regret. They walked in like a funeral procession, my father first, then my mother, with Ryder and Hayden trailing behind like lost children. They still wore their expensive labels, the Chanel jackets, the custom suits, but the glamour was gone. My mother's lipstick was slightly uneven, my father's tie was crooked, and Ryder, he was staring at his scuffed shoes. They looked like people who hadn't slept since the gavel fell, people who had finally realized that their bank accounts were empty, and their favors had all run out. Autumn, sweetheart, my mother began, her voice dripping with that syrupy sweetness she used whenever she wanted me to do her chores as a child. Can you give your family just 5 minutes? She asked, her hand trembling as she reached out, but she stopped herself before she touched my arm. I looked at her, and then at my father, who was standing with his hands clasped in front of him like a schoolboy in the principal's office. We've been talking nonstop, he added, his voice gravelly and tired. We were wrong, Autumn. We see that now. The way we treated you, it wasn't right. We're sorry. The word sorry felt heavy in the air like a stone dropped in a well. I waited, letting the silence grow, letting them wonder if I was going to scream, or cry, or hug them. I led them into the back office. The room still smelled of fresh paint and expensive leather. And what exactly does start fresh mean to you? I asked, my voice cold, like a blade of ice. My father jumped in immediately, his eyes bright with a desperate kind of hope. The store's this brand. You obviously know what you're doing, he said, leaning forward. But we could help. I have the contacts. Ryder knows operations. Hayden is great with marketing. It could be a family business again, like we always dreamed. I looked at Ryder, who gave a half shrug. No hard feelings, right? We all win. I almost laughed, but I didn't. I just stared at them, wondering how they could still be so incredibly blind. I led them to the 5th floor, to a conference room that felt more like a courtroom. The air was chilled, and the downtown Charlotte skyline stretched out behind me like a map of the world I now owned. My lead attorney, Olivia Chin was already waiting. She didn't smile. She didn't move. She just stood there with 3 thick black folders, like 3 loaded weapons ready to fire. My family sat in a row opposite us, suddenly looking very small, very fragile. My mother opened her mouth, ready to start another round of sweetheart and family, but I raised one finger and the room went dead silent. Before any of you say another word, I began, my voice level, devoid of heat. There are 2 things you need to understand. I nodded to Olivia, and she slid the first folder across the polished wood. Effective today, all family relationships are legally terminated, complete disinheritance. No contact orders. Everything was submitted to the court this morning. I watched my father's face, the way his mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man watching his house burn down, but I wasn't done. I was just getting warmed up. Olivia opened the second folder, and I saw the moment the oxygen left the room. Second, I continued. Harper and Sons, your old menswear company, has been 100% owned by my trust for 3 years. Ryder shot out of his chair, his face twisting into something ugly. You're full of it, he screamed. That company is Dad's legacy. I didn't look at him. I looked at my father. I purchased your debt when the banks were ready to foreclose. I told him. You kept receiving paychecks because I allowed it. That allowance is now revoked. Hayden burst into loud, messy tears, her hands over her face. You can't take our jobs, she sobbed. We have bills, we have lives. My mother reached across the table, her fingers trembling as she touched the wood. Autumn, baby, please, we're begging you, don't do this. I looked at her, and I remembered the night she refused to look up from her magazine while I walked out the door. The 2 stores Ryder manages will cease operations in 30 days. I said, ignoring her hand. After that, all communication ends. You wanted to be assets? You are nothing but liabilities, and I am cutting you loose. Power isn't just about having money in the bank. It's about watching the people who look down on you finally have to look up. I decided to give Ryder a job, not because I loved him, but because I wanted him to understand the weight of $1. I put him in the distribution center, the hottest, loudest part of the empire. There were no air-conditioned offices for him, no expensive lunches. Just a blue polyester vest, a mop, and the smell of cardboard and sweat. I walked through the warehouse one afternoon, my team of directors following behind me. I saw him, the brother who once called me a parasite. He was scrubbing a spill near the loading dock. His hands, once soft from golf and luxury, were now red, blistered, and shaking. He looked up as my shadow fell over him. I saw the flash of anger in his eyes, followed quickly by the cold, hard reality of his situation. He expected me to say something to mock him, but I didn't. That would have meant he still mattered. My father didn't fare much better. I kept him as a consultant for exactly 30 days, just to show him how obsolete his ideas had become. I watched him sit in the break room, drinking cheap coffee, looking at the spreadsheets he couldn't understand. He tried to give orders to my managers, but they just looked at him with pity. To them, he wasn't the great Harper. He was just a man whose time had passed, a relic of a failed era. I didn't fire him. I let him realize on his own that he was the dead weight now. Is there a problem with the floor, Ryder? I asked, my voice calm, projecting across the quiet warehouse. He stopped mopping, his jaw tightening until I thought his teeth might break. No. Miss Harper, he muttered, the words sounding like they were being dragged through broken glass. Good. I replied, make sure it's spotless. We have guests arriving in an hour. I turned away, leaving him there in the dirt. It wasn't about being cruel, it was about education. I was teaching them the lesson they tried to teach me, that in this world, you only get what you earn. 2 months later, the world had moved on, and the Harpers had moved out. I found myself standing in front of a gray brick apartment building off Albemarle Road, the kind of place where the walls are paper-thin, and the air always smells of laundry detergent and old cooking oil. It was a far cry from the gated community where I grew up. There were no guards here, no manicured lawns, just a cracked parking lot and the distant sound of a siren. I stepped out of my car, my heels clicking on the rough asphalt, a sound that felt out of place in a neighborhood that had forgotten what luxury looked like. I knocked on the door of apartment 4B. I heard the heavy thud of a deadbolt, and then my father opened it. He wasn't wearing a custom suit anymore. He was in a faded polo shirt, his hair uncombed, his eyes sunken. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his name no longer carried weight. Behind him, my mother sat on a sofa that looked like it had been bought at a garage sale, her designer handbags replaced by a plastic bin of laundry. The room was small, cramped, and silent, like a tomb for people who were still breathing. I didn't come with a check or a contract. I came with a ghost. I walked into the center of the room and placed the old brown suitcase on their wobbly coffee table, the same suitcase I had carried out of their house 13 years ago. The leather was peeling, the rope handle was frayed, and it looked like a piece of trash in their tiny living room. "What is this?" my father whispered. His voice cracked. I didn't answer. I just unzipped it. The sound of the metal teeth catching was the only thing I could hear. Inside lay the $237, the exact amount I'd had when they threw me away. "This is your inheritance," I said, my voice as cold as the rain from that night. 13 years ago, you told me I was dead weight. You told me I was a parasite, and you gave me this, thinking it was all I was worth. I saw my mother's eyes fill with tears, but I didn't feel a thing. "I'm returning it to you now because I don't need it, but you're going to need every penny." I turned toward the door, leaving the suitcase open, leaving the money, and leaving the only family I'd ever known to rot in the silence they created. 1 year has passed since the gavel fell, and the world feels lighter. I stand here on the 42nd floor of my new headquarters, watching the sun set over a city I helped build. Evelyn Rose is no longer just a retail chain, it's a movement. 38 new stores open this year, revenue has tripled, and every business magazine calls it the turnaround of the century. But when I look at the skyline, I don't see the money. I see the girl who sat in the back of a Greyhound bus, wondering if she would survive the night. I didn't just survive. I conquered. I don't check on them anymore, but the world has a way of feeding me the news anyway. My father and mother are still in that apartment, living on a fixed income that barely covers the rent. Ryder, the brother who thought he was a king, is now stocking shelves in a big box store, working 14-hour shifts for minimum wage. I hear he doesn't laugh much anymore. And Hayden, she's a cashier at the same mall where she used to spend thousands on a Saturday. They are living the life they once thought I deserved. And the irony is, I didn't have to do anything to make it happen. I just had to stop carrying them. But my real victory isn't their failure. It's the Harper Rising Fund. $10 million a year, dedicated to kids who were told they were dead weight. I spend my weekends meeting them, reading their essays, looking into their eyes, and seeing the same fire that kept me warm in that cold diner. We don't just give them money. We give them a shield and a promise that no one can take away their future unless they allow it. I used the name Harper for the fund, not to honor my father, but to reclaim the name for the girl who made it mean something. Sometimes, at 3 a.m., I still hear the sound of that suitcase zipping shut, but it doesn't make me flinch anymore. It's just a reminder of how far I've come. I don't need their apologies. I don't need their love, and I certainly don't need their approval. I am Autumn Harper, and I am exactly who I was meant to be. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you were nothing, remember my story. The world might throw you away, but you are the only one who decides where you land. Thank you for listening to my journey on Bitter and Sweet. Until our next story, keep building your own kingdom.